So now we have everyone, all the panelists, they're all seated, and we have also the moderator next to me, Mr. Huang. Mr. Huang will moderate the panel discussion on development. He is a member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. He has more than 25 years of professional experience as a Chinese diplomat, through which he has established rich experience in the areas of peacekeeping and peace building, and also humanitarian affairs. He is committed to working towards the implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action and the International Decade for People of African Descent to ensure equality, dignity, justice, and development for African people and people of African descent. Mr. Huang, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an honor for me to moderate the panel discussion on the theme development, during which we will hear about existing initiatives and opportunities for promoting economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to development for Africans and people of African descent in Asia and the Pacific region, as well as some of the challenges faced. We will also learn more about the contributions of Africans and people of African descent to the development of societies in the region. For the first part, we have the pleasure to welcome three distinguished panelists. Let me introduce them. First, Ms. Ashwini K.P. is the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. She is also a co-founder of Zaria, Women's Alliance for Dignity and Equality. Ms. Ashwini K.P. has previously worked as a researcher on the project Mukti, as a senior campaigner on business and human rights with Amnesty International India, is a guest faculty member of the Department of Political Science at Mount Carmel College, and as a lecturer of the Department of Political Science of St. Joseph College in India. She was also an assistant professor of political science at St. Joseph's College in India and has authored several publications on the issue of discrimination. She holds a MPhil and PhD in South Asian Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University. And the second panelist, also on the right, I think, no, is she online? Online. Okay, she's online. Ms. Eunice Kwalteng is a coordinator of publication and external relations and of the program for African Diaspora and Descent in Japan of the African Japan Forum. Ms. Kwalteng is a Ghanaian born raised in Japan. She graduated from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies in 2023 with a bachelor's degree in arts. She lived most of her life in Japan as an undocumented immigrant or as a karihomensha, term used to individuals who have lost their resident status or visas and are on provisional release without options to work or obtain revenue. After being granted a visa in April 2023, she started an internship program at Africa-Japan Forum, where she holds her current positions. And the third panelist, Mr. Philip Binondo, on the right, is a human rights advocate with over a decade of experience in the intersection of education, sustainable development, and human rights. He is a former United Nations OHCHR Fellow for People of African Descent and a founding member of the African Diaspora Insight and the African American Coaches and Athletes of the Philippines, AFCAAP. He has taught international relations and human rights at the La Salle University in Manila. Currently, he is the Community Relations and Corporate Communications Manager at JE Hydro and Bioenergy Corporation. So next, I would give the floor to our first panelist, Ms. Ashwini K.P. Madam, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair, distinguished panelists, moderator, and attendees. It is a pleasure to be here today to be part of these discussions on important topic of development as one of the 3 core pillars of the International Decade for People of African Descent. I thank OHCHR as the organizers of the event for inviting me to take part. In addition to development being a core pillar of the decade, the full realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to development, for all people of African descent has been incorporated within a wide range of international human rights law provisions, as well as other international frameworks and standards. Both the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights enshrine the right to self-determination. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights also codifies the principle of non-discrimination in relation to the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. The International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination provides the most comprehensive prohibition of racial discrimination in international human rights law. According to ICER's comprehensive prohibition of all forms of racial discrimination, states must combat intentional or direct racial discrimination, as well as de facto or indirect racial discrimination, including as it relates to development and the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights. Article 5 of ICER guarantees the right of everyone without distinction as to race, color, or national or ethnic origin to equality before law, including in the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights such as right to work, housing, education, health, participation in cultural rights. The 2001 Durban Declaration, the Program of Action, as the most comprehensive plan of action for combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance within the United Nations system, reiterates that persisting colonial legacies of racial and ethnic inequality are manifested in economic and social conditions. It identifies that racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance remain a cause of underdevelopment and recognizes the need to make the right to development a reality for everyone. The 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development recognizes the right to development as an inalienable human right by virtue of which every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedom can be fully realized. The Declaration also recognizes the right to self-determination and obligates states to take resolute steps to eliminate the massive and flagrant violations of human rights of people and human beings affected by situations such as those resulting from apartheid, all forms of racism and racial discrimination, colonialism, foreign domination, and occupation. Most recently, the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development promised to leave no one behind the eradication of poverty and hunger and the realization of a vision for a world of universal respect of human rights and human dignity, the rule of law, justice, equality, and non-discrimination of respect for race, ethnicity, and cultural diversity. Despite this plethora of international standards recognizing the full enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to development, many people of African descent, including in Asia-Pacific region, continue to live in situations of significant underdevelopment and inequality, which exist along racial and ethnic lines. Underdevelopment, inequality, and socioeconomic exclusion, deprivation are both cause of consequence of systemic racism experienced by those of people of African descent, as recognized by the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination in their General Recommendation 34. The important contributions that those of African descent make within the Asia-Pacific, including to sustainable development, are often not adequately recognized. Moreover, racism and racial discrimination against people of African descent in the Asia-Pacific region is often overlooked or receives limited attention. To give a specific example of the systemic racism experienced by those of people of African descent in Asia, I will speak briefly about the Siddi community in India, where I am from. The Siddi people are Afro-descendants whose ancestors were brought to India as slaves, who live in rural areas of Goa, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, and Gujarat. The Siddi community face multiple and mutually reinforcing forms of systemic discrimination and exclusion along racial and ethnic lines. This includes social stigma and interpersonal racism, a lack of inequitable access to education and training, dearth of decent work opportunities and economic exploitation, non-existent or poor quality healthcare, and inadequate housing. Siddi people have also faced threats in terms of accessing their land, self-determination, and cultural practices. These forms of discrimination and exclusion has been exacerbated by the difficulties that the Siddi communities have faced in organizing, accumulating political and social capital, and exercising their right to societal and political participation. Limited or absence of a substantial national-wide data on the Siddi population in India, including their socio-economic status and other challenges, hinders her comprehensive understanding of their distinct needs and the targeted interventions required to address their systemic marginalization. Another notable Afro-descent community is the Shidi community in Pakistan, which constitutes the largest African immigrant population in South Asia, who are yet have been severely underrepresented in different quarters of the society in Pakistan. Relying mainly on manual labor for their livelihood, the Shidis continues to be marginalized in Pakistan, despite residing along the Arabian Ocean shores for many, many centuries. A large number are compelled to reside in ghettos in southern part of the country with limited prospects for their economic and social and political advancement. As a result, the community is trapped in a cycle of poverty and low educational attainment, leading to stigmatization and racial profiling. Likewise, Kafis in Sri Lanka and Makrani and Abshi community in South Asia also face systemic forms of racism, racial discrimination, and exclusion. Most of the African descent communities present in South Asia also experience limited or no access in terms of receiving positive engagement from the governments and other related institutions. I see many challenges in addressing the underdevelopment, inequality, and socioeconomic exclusion and deprivation of people of African descent in Asia Pacific region, and will discuss a handful of most pertinent before offering some conclusions and high-level recommendations. One fundamental challenge which was raised in my predecessor's 2022 report to the Human Rights Council on the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development is the shallow commitment to racial justice and equality within the mainstream international development framework. While the 2030 Agenda itself and the Sustainable Development Goals are in many ways a marked improvement over the Millennium Development Goals, the commitment to racial equality and alignment with key human rights and racial justice standards are still inadequate. The increased attention to human rights, equality, and non-discrimination within 2030 Agenda has been characterized as being largely performative and to specific human rights and racial justice standards. One of the most glaring omissions of 2030 Agenda is with regards to the lack of reference to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Another fundamental weakness of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is the lack of explicit acknowledgement of colonialism and slavery as a driver of underdevelopment, poverty, and socio-economic deprivation and exclusion of racially marginalized people, particularly people of African descent. The historical legacies of colonialism and slavery are clear when you look both at the underdevelopment of many of the countries in Asia-Pacific region. and as well as the situation of most of the racially marginalized groups within the region. Prevailing development frameworks fail to articulate these links or provide redress for historical injustice. There is an urgent need to include reparative development approach as envisioned in the Durban Declaration Program of Action into mainstream international development frameworks. The promise of leaving no one behind is not possible without development frameworks that explicitly acknowledge and address the historical and ongoing harms of colonialism and slavery, as well as the economic gains of many former colonial powers and how fundamental these were to their development. As such, development frameworks, including the 2030 Agenda, preserve colonial injustice, perpetuate the domination of powerful nations over people and territories that were subject to historical colonial extraction, and fail to disrupt structural racial discrimination within nations. Moreover, specific development frameworks such as 2030 Agenda are embedded within an imbalanced international order that is itself a direct legacy of colonialism and slavery. As my predecessor, Ms. Tendai Achiume, highlighted in an urgent need to radically transform the international order according to anti-imperial, redistributive, and reparative approaches. Another significant challenge is the invisibility of people of African descent within the implementation of development frameworks, particularly the 2030 Agenda. The overall implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals has been weak. Moreover, the implementation framework in place do not pay sufficient attention to racial justice, equality, non-discrimination, making weak implementation also inequitable. The Sustainable Development Goals function as top-level commitments. The goals have associated targets which establish the specific outcomes that are used to determine attainment of the individual goals. Each target, in turn, has at least one indicator used to track its progress. Indicators thus play a crucial role in resource allocation and project prioritization. Racial equality and non-discrimination, including in relation to people of African descent, have been deprioritized in the indicators and overall implementation framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. Accordingly, it is no surprise that adequate resources have not been directed to combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. The 27th report of the Working Group of People of African Descent highlighted how important indicators and data disaggregation are to determining the extent to which people of African descent are benefiting or being ignored. The importance of inclusive disaggregated data was also highlighted within the working group's operational guidelines on the inclusion of the people of African descent in the 2030 Agenda. The people of African descent in many parts of the Asia-Pacific region are amongst the most invisible populations. I perceive there to be a dearth of both data and attention on their situation at the national and international levels, deepening the discrimination and exclusion they are subjected to. To conclude, racial justice, equality, non-discrimination, including for people of African descent, requires far greater transformation than is possible within the 2030 Agenda as embedded within the current international economic order. Urgent attention must be given to alternative approaches and development pathways, which are grounded in explicit acknowledgement of colonialism and slavery, and the need to provide reparatory justice for the harms of these phenomena, including underdevelopment, poverty, and inequality between and within the countries. Having said that, there is untapped potential to improve the situation of people of African descent in the implementation of 2030 Agenda. States, the United Nations, the multinational development institutions must simultaneously take action to both transform mainstream development paradigms and do everything in their power to harness the 2030 agenda to improve the lives of people of African descent. To do this, United Nations and multinational development institutions should draw upon important racial justice standards, including the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action, the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Working Group on People of African Descent's operational guidelines on the inclusion of people of African descent in the 2030 agenda. It is vital that with such efforts, far greater attention is given to the situation and needs of people of African descent within Asia-Pacific region, who are amongst the most marginalized and invisible groups globally. At last, I would like to conclude by saying that inclusivity and intersectionality must constitute the cornerstone of any comprehensive strategy for attaining racial justice and equality in the process of development for people of African descent in Asia-Pacific region. Their experiences and perspective must be centered and integrated into policy making and implementation process to ensure full and equal participation in society, and also address the specific challenges they face and promote their rights and dignity and overall development. The decade is an important tool for achieving this, and I will therefore conclude by appealing the member states to support a second decade for people of African descent. I end here, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Madam Ashwini. I would say that you have provided a very enlightened presentation and a very comprehensive presentation, which you focus on the importance of the implementation of the DDPA, the ICERT, and also the guidelines provided by the WGEPAD, as well as the recommendations by the CERD 34. And also, it's important for member states to provide more resources in implementation of all these international instruments, as well as the framework of development, including the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Also, I think you also remind us of the importance that we need to look at the consequences of the colonialism and slavery for centuries, which have continued to, which is continuing causing the consequences, negative consequences on the people of African descent, as well as to establish a more just and economic order. It is also important in this regard. And I am enlightened also by your appeal to the international community, especially the member states, to support the proclamation of the second international decade for people of African descent. And I think that we can continue to work towards this goal. Thank you, Madam Ashwini. And now I would like to give the floor to our second panelist, Ms. Eunice Kwalteng, which would deliver the representation online. Madam, are you ready?
Yes, good morning.
Thank you.
I'm Eunice Kwalteng, and before I begin, I would like to thank the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and everybody involved in this meeting for this opportunity to participate and present in this panel discussion. I truly consider it a great honor. Sorry, can you see the screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Today, as I address the challenges of an enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, I would like to mainly speak on the challenges and activities of the youth of African descent in Japan. I would like to make this presentation as the youth of African descent living in Japan, and also share the cultural and social challenges that many people of African descent in Japan are facing, including my personal life. I am a Ghanaian born and raised in Japan, and I had I spent most of my life as a karihomensha, which was very, very hard, and I will address this at the end of the presentation. After graduating university, I started working in Africa-Japan Forum as the coordinator of publication and external relations and the coordinator of the program for African Diaspora and Descent in Japan. First, I would like to talk about Africa-Japan Forum, which was established in 1994 and is based in Tokyo. It's a non-profit, non-governmental, independent organization, and AJF has purpose to build relationships with civil society in Africa to advocate on health, food security, human rights, and so on. We also organize events and activities for children and youth of African descent living in Japan for the development of social and cultural rights. In Africa-Japan Forum, we have an awareness-raising program. We hold events, seminars, and university lectures to share about Africa and the African people. This is a picture of an event we participated in last year. It is called Global Festa Japan. And this is one of Japan's largest gatherings where many organizations from both the public and private sector attend to promote international cooperation, social contribution, and so on. We introduced our organization to visitors and also prepared African games and quizzes for them to enjoy and learn about Africa. We also provide information through e-newsletters on seminars, events, crowdfundings, African restaurants and shops in Japan, and other opportunities related to Africa. We also publish a Japanese magazine called Africa Now for an in-depth analysis of the situations in Africa. We touch on various topics such as politics, economy, health, social and cultural issues, and environmental issues as well. In this magazine, we also have a section dedicated to the African youths to write about their life experience and future aspirations and whatever they are interested in. We also collaborate with people of African roots and Japanese people who are interested in African culture. One example would be advertising events and programs on our social media website, and we sometimes co-host social events. We organize African Kids Club and African Youth Meetup programs, which I will introduce later. We also support African descent immigrants and refugees of African descent through collaborations with other organizations. In Japan, there is an event called Refugee and Migrant Festival. And in this festival, refugees and immigrants from various countries would prepare traditional food or accessories and bags, which are available for purchase. And this event is a great financial help for the refugees and immigrants in Japan. And most of our visitors who attend this festival are Japanese, so it is also a wonderful opportunity to interact with cultures from all over the world, including Africa. Now, I would like to address the challenges that people with African roots face in Japan. One of the challenges would be the Japanese expressions that use the word Black in a negative context. In Japan, we sometimes use the word Black to represent bad things and the word white to represent good things. And this is a pretty common expression used in Japan. For example, we will often say in our conversations, Black kigyo or Black company to represent a company that has a toxic working environment. And on the other hand, we would say White kigyo or white company to represent a company that has a good or ideal working conditions. The issue with this problem is that many Japanese people are not aware that these expressions could encourage discrimination, and we are currently working on raising awareness on this issue. Racial profiling is also considered an issue among people with African roots. According to a survey by Tokyo Bar Association, between 2016 and 2021, 82% of people with African roots had been questioned by the police, of which 37% had been questioned more than 6 times during the 5-year period. And since the majority of foreigners who had been questioned by the police felt that they were targeted solely because they were foreigners or had foreign roots, it is highly likely that people with African roots felt targeted for their appearance as well. I believe these issues deny people of African descent of their dignity and human rights. Another issue within the African community is the Japanese dress codes in schools. It is not rare for students born with curly hair to struggle to meet the school standards for hair. Hairstyles such as cornrows are often a huge part of African culture. However, braiding is often not allowed in Japanese schools. There was an incident that happened last year where a high school student was not allowed to formally attend his graduation ceremony because he came to school with a cornrow. The student and the family members were asked to watch the ceremony from a different area, and the student was also instructed not to respond to his name being called. The school's response was that the student had not explained his ethnic background and the reason for wearing cornrows. These are some of the social and cultural challenges that people with African roots face on a daily basis. And these experiences can have a negative impact on the younger generation. Because people of African descent are a minority among the foreigner group in Japan, some children have a hard time feeling accepted or have a sense of not belonging in the Japanese society, which can negatively affect the development of the community, a healthy development of the community and individuals. AJF received a request to hold events for African families with children to build a community to address the various challenges that African descents face. This is when the African Kids Club started in 2005, and throughout the years, African families and even Japanese parents and children who are interested have participated in the events organized by African Kids Club. African Kids Club is based in Tokyo, Kanto region, and today our activities have spread to Tokai and the Kansai region. We have African Kids Club Tokai and African Kids Club Kansai, and they hold events in their respective regions, but also would sometimes collaborate and co-host events as well. We also started an online dance class event and other online programs during COVID, and we had people from all over Japan take part in our programs. Next, I would like to introduce some events that African Kids Club organized. We believe that these events help the children and youth of African descent to develop confidence in themselves and their African roots. This was an Afrobeats dance class that took place in a hybrid format. The dance teacher is a young adult with African roots, and she teaches children Afrobeats dance moves from various countries in Africa. This was another event where African children and the youth got to spend time together and connect with people with similar backgrounds. This was a great opportunity to share their life experiences and worries and troubles that affect their economic, social, and cultural rights. There were over 50 participants, and I believe this shows the interest among the African community to connect and share the challenges that they face in their personal lives. This is the African Youth Meetup. This is a group of African children who have grown into young adults and organize their own events. They mainly focus on having an in-depth discussion about life experience as a youth with African roots. There are also events that focus on cultural identity in Japan. Some events focus on in-depth discussions, and some events approach this topic through crafts, games, and short films. We also had a curly hair workshop for children to learn hair care and cultural identity. These events and social gatherings are a great opportunity for the children and the youth to learn their cultural identity and how to express their cultural and social rights in Japan. Lastly, I would like to briefly share my experience as a karihomensha in Japan. Karihomensha is a Japanese word, and it refers to foreigners on provisional release. They do not have a visa, and many of them are actively seeking a visa to be able to stay in Japan. They have no right to work, health insurance, or social welfare, and their movements are restricted as well. So they need to have a permission from the government to be able to travel to different prefectures. I lived in this condition from when I was 8 to 23 years old, and it was a very hard period of my life. Our economic rights were denied because my parents could not work, and we were only able to survive this situation with the help of God, church friends, and relatives. And my experience as a karihomensha and my connection to AJF is what led to my passion for human rights and what I do now. Through the presentation, I explained what kind of challenges people of African descent face and the activities they have developed throughout the years. We want to support young African descent to enjoy their economic, social, and cultural rights and help them feel confident and comfortable with their African roots. We also would like to provide a place of belonging, community, and networking opportunities for the youth, parents, and children. So in closing, we call on the United Nations and member states to take action and to support this cause. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you all for your patience, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Eunice, for the very informative and vivid description of your personal experience, as well as the work has carried out by the AJF, which is very meaningful, I can see, because you are raising awareness of what the situation is by the people of African descent in Japan, and also your personal experience as a karihomensha. And I think your call for the more action by UN and member states to look into this situation is very important. And I know that we need to join hands to put rhetoric into actions. Thank you, Eunice, and take care. Now I would like to give the floor to our third panelist, Mr. Binondo. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And moderator, chairperson, moderator, excellencies, distinguished experts, and members of the different UN mechanisms, esteemed fellow panelists and fellow advocates for people of African descent, ladies and gentlemen, good day to all of you. Firstly, I'd like to thank the OHCHR for this invitation to take part in this regional meeting and also making this event possible. It also brings me great pleasure and pride to see so many familiar faces after being the only black face during the 2018 regional OHCHR anti-racism meeting in Malaysia. This doesn't feel so alone after all. The Philippines prides itself as one of the more pluralistic and multiracial Asia-Pacific countries in the region. Yet, the lack of disaggregated data makes it difficult to really quantify and even qualify the demographics and conditions of our diverse population. Moreover, people of African descent and their situation have often been overlooked, their issues and concerns remaining on the sidelines despite our growing population. The fact remains that as racial minorities, we continue to face deprivations, socioeconomic disadvantage, marginalization, due to stigma, bias, and prejudice. Arguably, racial inequities and injustices are perpetuated in Philippine society, not by design, but by the failure to dismantle and reform the remnants of colonialism that continue to root themselves in the educational system, especially in areas with a higher concentration of young people of African descent. As a result, educational spaces in these areas have become a means by which these stereotypes and feelings of inferiority have become internalized. Issues on self-worth haunt young people of African descent, deeply affecting their psyche and sense of agency. I wish to echo parts of my previous statements made to the working group during their 30th session in 2022. The traumatizing incidents experienced by young people of African descent, ranging from discrimination, name-calling, verbal harassment, to incitement to physical violence or hate-mongering, have essentially disempowered them from becoming productive and self-sustaining members of society. Sadly, many of these incidents have been reported to continually taking place in classrooms and schoolyards. Kuchera and Kaputi's study correlate how these negative experiences affect the ability of young people of African descent to become well-adjusted adults. As a result of these incidents, the study participants mentioned experiencing homelessness, underemployment, unemployment during their young adult years because of them dropping out of school or not even pursuing higher education. These early childhood traumas, which young people of African descent disproportionately suffer from, hinder their ability to attain economic and financial freedom, which contribute to the vicious circle of intergenerational deprivations. These are among the major reasons why young people of African descent have such difficulty overcoming racial prejudice and bias, not to mention a life of dignity that may enable them to reach their own potential. When one's sense of self-identity and self-worth are still in crisis, these traumas continue to haunt us. It is therefore imperative that anti-Black attitudes and conceptions be overcome by establishing greater solidarity among people of African descent in the region. Greater collaboration, cooperation, and research will help widen the discussions on race relations and anti-Black racism that will afford young people of African descent the opportunity to feel included and develop a sense of self-worth and self-confidence that will help address intergenerational deprivation. While the manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia in different forms continue to persist in Philippine society, it is important to acknowledge the incremental steps and improvements taken to address these issues. The focus of my presentation for today's panel will be twofold. First, I will attempt to provide a glimpse on how social media has impacted racism, its current manifestations, and how Philippine society is dealing with this matter. Second, I will attempt to highlight the positive contributions of people of African descent to Philippine society and how we can leverage this as an opportunity to raise awareness and deepen the conversations on race and people of African descent as a strategy to expand and hopefully extend the program of activities of the International Decade for People of African Descent. Social media is increasingly playing a critical role in the conversations of race and race relations, albeit as a double-edged sword. On one hand, the privilege of anonymity and the ability to instantaneously express one's feelings and opinions has allowed wider access for people to engage and discuss issues that matter to them. Unfortunately, this has given space for the abuse of the freedom of expression, wherein people have become unafraid to express their feelings and thoughts about an issue, not to mention the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation. This has allowed greater space for hate speech to emerge, which at times has targeted racial minorities, especially people of African descent. On the other hand, Social media has also allowed human rights activists and social justice advocates to call out behavior and language that is discriminatory, while also educating people about the context and history as to why certain statements are offensive and unacceptable. In some ways, social media platforms have allowed both healthy and unhealthy and democratic discussions on what constitutes mindful language and behavior, especially in this day and age of diversity and inclusion advocacies. As these discussions become viral and trending, at times individuals being called out, especially if they have a strong social following, apologize, admit remorse, and help spread awareness on these issues, helping create a better understanding of these issues. Through the help of social media, greater awareness and education is becoming accessible in helping individuals become more cognizant of their actions. In the Philippines, the presence of people of African descent or dark-skinned individuals that don't necessarily identify with this term can be categorized as follows. First is indigenous people, as you can see in the image in the middle, such as the Igorots, Aitas, Mangyans, who comprise most of the people that, most of the individuals that the CERD normally takes into consideration in their report. The second group is the first generation Filipinos of African descent, such as myself, which include individuals who are born abroad to a Filipino parent and naturalized Filipinos who have acquired citizenship by living in the Philippines. The third category is second generation people of African descent, or children of interracial marriages and partnerships born in the Philippines. A large number of these are also offsprings of American servicemen during the time of the American bases in the Philippines. And fourth is the migrant people of African descent, who are mostly students, athletes, and business people or expatriate employees. In the face of these classifications, people of African descent still remain invisible and unrecognized in the country. The UN CERD, in its observations and concluding remarks for the Philippines, has mostly dealt with racism issues in relation to indigenous people. In the 110th session of the committee last April 2023, the representatives of civil society from the Philippines and the Human Rights Commission, which is our national human rights institution, Commissioner Feida Maniri Dumarpa pointed out the continued lack of disaggregate data which could aid in determining the actual population and conditions of racial minorities, including people of African descent. On a brighter note, despite the challenges faced by people of African descent in the Philippines, first and second generation Filipinos of African descent have overcome these hardships and have found ways to contribute to society, especially in the field of sports. In the most recent Asian Games, considered to be the Asian Olympics hosted by China, the Philippine men's basketball team was an exemplary display of how Filipino people of African descent helped bring the country's first gold medal since 1962. With 5 players out of the 12-man roster comprising people of African descent, their contribution to this victory is undeniable. This victory also had some controversy as other participating states questioned the eligibility of Filipino people of African descent based on their nationality. This backlash galvanized Filipinos back at home to defend the citizenship and ancestry of these players. Prior to that, during the Southeast Asian Games in Cambodia, also in 2023, the Philippines was also able to capture the gold medal it lost in the previous edition of the Games. Filipinos took immense pride in the team, calling it the Filipino Redeem Team. And finally, in the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup, it was another Filipino person of African descent in Sarina Bolden who brought the country pride by scoring the first and only goal for the Philippines in the tournament. This was also the first time the Philippines qualified for this prestigious tournament. It is a fact that several Filipino athletes of African descent are record holders of the country and medalists in international and regional athletic competitions. Philippine national sports agencies have been actively trying to identify mixed-race Filipino athletes in the diaspora to represent the country in sporting competitions and help elevate the quality of sports in the country. This has also led to several people of African descent from the continent to consider the Philippines as a possible destination for higher studies and professional sports careers, especially in football. Philippine schools and universities have also given athletic scholarships to people of African descent from the continent they consider having the potential to excel. It is noteworthy that people of African descent have significantly contributed to the enhancement of sports development and diversity of Philippine society. Perhaps this is one way to finally recognize the positive impact that migration of people of African descent have had on Philippine society. Ultimately, the presence of people of African descent in the Philippines has benefited society by bringing to the forefront discussion on racial diversity, stereotyping, and hate speech. While the social integration might have been challenging in the beginning, the fact that majority of people of African descent, especially from the continent, have remained and even intermarried with locals is a sign that Philippine society is and has been progressing in terms of racial harmony and acceptance. This is not to say that incidents of racism and racial discrimination have ceased. However, with the growing population of people of African descent, awareness on these issues have grown and Filipinos have come to the defense of our population when it mattered. My only hope is that this extends beyond the realm of sports and permeates into the social fiber that binds us as a country. Extending the decade can give the Philippines more opportunities to show solidarity and support in promoting the cause of people of African descent in the Asia-Pacific. And before I end, I would just like to also invite everyone to our side event right after this, which is on extending the decade, to be organized by our former fellows, including myself. So I just wanted to plug that before I end my presentation. So thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you, Philip, for your wonderful presentation and sharing a lot of information regarding the contribution, the important contribution made by people of African descent to the social economy life in Philippines and also in Asia Pacific. And also I'm amazed by the wonderful championship of your national basketball team. Also, I would like to see that your comments, including the double blade, the term of a double blade sword, including the role of social media, also requires our attention, because we know that on the one hand, we can raise awareness and also enhance education on the exact situation and also history and also the contribution of people of African descent in Asia Pacific. On the other hand, we need to prevent and also to fight against those hate speech and also misinformation, disinformation on people of African descent on social media. And this is a very good point, I think. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have heard the representations by the three wonderful panelists. And now I will give the floor to the audience, first to the representative of the member states. Anyone would like to take the floor? Okay, I see Philippines. Yeah, you have the floor, madam.
Mr. Moderator. Good morning, colleagues, and thank you to our panelists, especially to Philip, for presenting a very truthful scenario landscape of what's happening in the Philippines. What you've said about discrimination, stereotypes, and expressions of racism, online and offline, taking place in the Philippines are of course true. There's nothing to deny there. You see, as a post-colonial developing and a country with a lot of migrants all over the world, we tend to focus inward and focus and be consumed with our own vulnerabilities, that we fail to see what's happening also within our society and how sometimes what we've been fighting for against, we sometimes do it ourselves to others in particular sectors of our society. So that is a fact. But having said that, the Philippines has always supported the International Decade for People of African Descent, the fight against racism, xenophobia, multilaterally. And of course, domestically, as you've said, many instances of racism and discrimination against, not only against people of African descent, but also even within our own indigenous communities are being perpetrated because, not necessarily by design, but because of our history and the system that has emerged because of our experience. So it's true, and there is a need really for forum like this to tell us governments of what's happening in our society, because sometimes we're blind to this. The absence of facts, it's true. As you've said, we've had this constructive dialogue with CERD, Madam Vice Chair is here, and also with CMW, and we were asked about figures, demographics we don't have on people of African descent. And it's not because we have data on others, it's just that sometimes the focus is elsewhere. And this is something that we admit that we should be working on in the future. Having said that, we agree that racism is one of the most pernicious problems in human rights because it nullifies and it undermines the most fundamental of truths, that we're all equal in rights and in dignity. And racism and discrimination have spawned structures of inequalities, and they are perpetuated. And this is seen as in many structures, global structures, that continues to hold many in the global south back. And when we talk about development, racial justice, and right to development, this intersectionalities between racism and development, they're all there. And this is also seen when we talk about climate justice, because climate change is one of the issues that have the greatest impact on our right to development and also on the enjoyment of a whole range of human rights. And this is something that we in Africa and Asia should be working together, because when it comes to climate change and right to development, this is a very difficult fight in the UN, and our colleague from China and in the NAM, basically, we know how this fight is going on. There is strong resistance on the operationalization and the adoption of a legally binding document on the right to development, and also on the implementation of international obligations in terms of climate action, which, if implemented in accordance with CBDRC, for instance, would go a long way in addressing all the systemic issues that impinge on the enjoyment of human rights. So in short, we thank OHCHR for this opportunity to discuss in an open manner the problems that we face on racism. I must admit that in the Philippines, when you talk about race, it's normally within the context of our post-colonial experience. But we are now like 100 plus years old as a country. We should move beyond that and, also assume responsibility for what we've failed to do during the time that we've been independent.
Thank you, Madam.
So,
please mind the time.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Madam. Excellent remarks. And I also agree that we need to make sure that global South, the solidarity among the global South in pushing forward the economic and the sustainable development goals. Thank you. And any next member state? Okay. Any other member states? Okay.
Sri Lanka.
Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Sri Lanka welcomes the positive outcome of the International Decade for People of African Descent, which has succeeded in calling for focused action to dismantle the many obstacles encountered by millions of people of African descent throughout the world, and for concerted action by member states to fight racism and racial discrimination. Sri Lanka is a co-organizer of the historic 1955 Bandung Conference, which brought Asian and African leaders together in their call for equality among all races and among all nations, both large and small. Sri Lanka has consistently supported UN initiatives at combating apartheid and stands in solidarity with fellow African nations and relevant mandates of the UN in calling for more vigorous and collective efforts by all stakeholders to address the causes as well as the effects of discrimination against persons of African descent which still persist. Men and women of African descent have made contributions to their societies and nations' development throughout history. Every human being, including people of African descent, have a right to development. Therefore, it is important that every state designs, adopts, and strengthens national programs for eradicating poverty and provide access to education and health to people of African descent without discrimination, as well as expand efforts to foster bilateral, regional, and international cooperation in implementing those programs. Sustainable development challenges in the Asia-Pacific region for people of African descent and other vulnerable groups are closely interlinked, interdependent, and mutually reinforcing. It is only through collective action towards development that we could turn this decade into a meaningful effort at ensuring recognition, justice, and development for people of African descent and other vulnerable populations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam. Yeah, okay, and then give the floor to other representatives. Okay, sir, you have the floor. Please identify yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, I am Dr. Sivaprakash, representing International Coalition of Agriculture Workers, as well as Human Development Organization. It's a very constructive session, but I see a little bit, how to say, lack of idea or silent about the right to development of women and girls of the African descent. So it's very important when we discuss about the overall right to development of the African descent. So what about the rights of the girls and women? So it's very important. For example, I can bring one example about the African descents who are living in the Asian countries or in the Pacific countries. They are right to culture and religion. Particularly, the one area is very important. It's very silent that female circumcision or the female genital mutilation. So this area is still practiced in some countries, even the African descent who are living in Asia and Pacific countries, particularly the right to health. So these kind of things which are very hidden within the community as well as in the state level, it should be discussed. It should be brought to the platform and public and discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments and also maybe a question. I think that maybe the panelists or anyone from other experts can answer the question. Thank you. Due to the time constraint, I think I will take one more question from the floor. Thank you. Miss, please, you have the floor.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. First of all, I'm very honored to be here. My name is Anisha Tai. I'm a social media content creator, choreographer, promoting African culture through music, dance, and videos online. It's, again, an honor to be here and share my experience with you. And I believe that these panelist talks deeply resonate with my experience and my current work to fight against racism and promote coexisting cultures and communities. So I would like to talk about 3 points that I believe is very important. So I was born and raised in Paris. I'm a child of an African mother and Asian father, and I've been living in Hong Kong for 7 years. The 3 points that I want to talk about is the importance of shared communities and creating that space of empathy. The second one is the importance of sport and art for our culture to shine. And the last one is definitely the social media responsibility. So for the first one, again, I'm a child of an African mother and an Asian father, and I believe they came together from a place of love and deep understanding. They found out that they had deep similarities, such as the value of family, serving communities. So I do believe that it is very important to create a dialogue on the ground level between communities, respect each other, promote empathy, and share our experience. So, yeah, I believe that if we come from a deep place of compassion, maybe that will be a good way to fight against racism and other issues. The second point that I want to talk about is, the importance of sport and arts. So I'm the first African woman to win a national TV dance competition in Hong Kong 2 years ago. And it was a pivotal moment for me and my African community in Asia. I think it showed that the openness of Hong Kong people to understand and celebrate other cultures. So, but the thing is that it was not always the case that I push my own culture and I learn it and I share it. I was born in France and I was told by my own African mother that I needed to learn ballet as it is the foundation of dance. And later after I lived in South Africa and I learned that actually ballet is a Eurocentric dance foundation. And actually Afro dance is also a legitimate dance foundation. So I really want to stress the importance of highlighting art in media. It is our responsibility to continuously promote our culture and help it to shine and share with local Asian community. And I think it's also very important that we combat the anti-Blackness and the internal racism that our own Black community has, such as my mom, because it can be perpetuated across the years. And I think we have some work to do also on our sides. And yes, that's something that I really want to stress. And the last point is social media. So I'm a social media content creator. I'm very lucky to have a large following. And I remember, so there was a few times in Hong Kong I was rejected in modeling casting because I was too Black or I was not Asian enough. So I think it's very important to use our platform to promote the Afrocentric beauty and again, show that there's no one way to think of what is beauty. So it is also important for us to create our own narrative and really embrace our identity. So that's why I felt the need to take over the social media platform and create my space to represent my people, because I felt like we were invisible or we looked at ugly. So I do believe, and I'm happy that other people like me, like Sam is here today to raise their voice, because as social media people, it is our responsibility to raise our voice and reach out people and share the knowledge, talk about events such as this one. I remember Ms. Watts was talking about the fact that we need to have connected platforms, and I do believe that we need to use our platform to, again, reach out the millions of people that we can reach out and call out people.
Yeah, maybe time, yeah.
Okay, sorry. But again, I hope that for the next decades, more young people like us will share what is happening and more people will be aware. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I would like to add my voice to your last comment regarding the role of the young generation, and because including yourself, you can make big voice, including by social media. And also, I appreciate that your comments regarding mutual respect, including culture among Asia and Africa. Thank you. I think we also have participants online. I would like to give the opportunity for them to raise one question, if any. The online participants, please.
Yes, we have one question.
Okay.
Grace.
So?
From Grace Williams.
From Grace Williams. Okay, Grace Williams, right? Yes. Okay. Can you hear me? You can hear the floor. You have the floor, Grace.
Sorry, I'm having difficulties unmuting myself. I think I've got it now. Are we all good? Yeah, cool. So hello, everyone. I'm Grace Williams from Tasmania, Australia, and I'm a 2023 former UN Fellow of African descent, speaking to you from the lands of the Mawanina people who did not survive British colonisation. Sovereignty was never ceded here in Luchuita, Tasmania. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Our fight for racial justice in Australia as people of African descent is inextricably linked to the ongoing struggle of First Peoples for their self-determination and human rights in a country that recently failed to recognise their voice in our constitution. Right now, as we sit at the intersection of a climate emergency and a transition to a digital future, which again leaves people of African descent behind and more vulnerable to experiencing further human rights violations, young people like myself are inheriting a world that is facing social, economic, and ecological challenges that require radical transformation. We will be the ones that have to live through the climate crisis, and we will deal with the aftermath of redefining development while finding ways to thrive in a world with rapidly collapsing ecosystems. With this in mind, it's crucial for important spaces like this that facilitate international dialogue to actively prioritize the voices of young people of African descent and provide them with the support and opportunities to develop leadership skills which are vital for a transition into a more racially equitable world. Africa has the fastest growing youngest population of any continent, and by 2050, 1 in 4 people on our planet will be African. Directing resources towards our emerging generation and equipping us with the tools to drive social change should be a critical component of the strategy to advance the human rights of people of African descent. In a world where most of the decision-making power is held by the baby boomer generation in the global north, an extension of the decade must involve an explicit focus on young people of African descent in order to shift power into the hands of the people most affected by systemic inequality. It's possible to achieve social transformation if those most affected by these challenges are included in creating solutions. And young people of African descent have a vital role to play in bringing about the changes that our planet, our economies, and our societies so desperately need. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Grace, for your comments and your active participation. As a UN fellow, I believe you can also join hands with other UN fellows across the region to make voice heard. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, due to the time constraint, I think I would like now return the floor to the panelists for any further comments and or maybe answer the questions by the gentleman. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments and intervention, and to the question with regards to gender, I would like to reiterate that in my presentation I had mentioned about intersectionality, and intersectionality refers to gender, women, LGBTQI communities, and I would like to reiterate that every anti-racism mechanism at the United Nations have consistently highlighted and focused on the aspect of gender, particularly women and children, and including other aspects of gender. And with regards to FGM, United Nations has consistently worked with member states to bring about awareness. As far as I'm aware, Kenya, Uganda, and a couple of other states have criminalized FGM, and there is consistent campaign to end FGM, and the other organizations which have consistently worked on FGM is UNICEF, UNFPA, UN Women, including World Health Organization. So with regards to all the anti-racism mechanisms at the United Nations, we have the strong conviction to focus on the gender aspect, and we do acknowledge that women from the African descent communities are doubly oppressed or triply oppressed, taking into consideration various aspects, and therefore focus on gender remains as one of the priorities for all the anti-racism mechanisms at the United Nations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Ashwini. Now, I think I can give the floor first to Philip, because you are in person. Yeah, 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And I also want to extend my appreciation to the representative from the Philippines who has said that they will support the decade. I hope that we can take this further and actually have activities in line with the program of activities of the International Decade. And just a final comment on the shared communities and utilizing other non-political aspects of promoting the decade and the rights of people of African descent. I think this is an area that we should really explore. We've already spent 10 years pursuing this in a very political manner, and I think perhaps it's time to also think outside the box and consider what people working outside the political arena can help us in promoting this event. And I mean, we have our UN fellows who've been doing amazing work in different areas in different countries in the Asia-Pacific region. So I hope the OHCHR and the United Nations can provide further support for us to be able to do what we can and what we can do best in order to promote the decade. So yeah, lastly, our event will be at 12:30. So I hope we see you. Ben, thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah, very effective comment. Eunice, are you online or you have any further comments?
Hello.
Hi, thank you.
Just would like to appreciate my fellow panelists and all the others who have commented. It has been a very great learning opportunity for me. I am very new in this field, and it has opened my eyes to many issues, not only in Japan, but other Asian countries. And I hope that we can further collaborate and further promote African to be able to live and thrive in their respective communities. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Eunice. Thank you. And I also I would like to share with you, also with other colleagues, that we have the 3rd annual session of the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent in April here in Geneva. And so, if possible, I welcome you to join us. And ladies and gentlemen, now we have heard all the comments and also a Q&A session. So I now would like to return the floor to Mr. Chair. Thank you for your active participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Huang, for your moderation and of this first panel, of the first part of the panel, because we will continue in the afternoon. I would like also to thank our distinguished panelists and the state representative, and also meeting participants for your contributions. I now declare this 3rd meeting closed. I invite all the attendees to reconvene at 1:30. So you'll have time for lunch and also time to participate, to attend the site event. Yeah. So just to insist. We'll continue our discussion this afternoon under the same theme on development. I also remind and invite all participants to the special event. So the special event is called Extending the Decade of People of African Descent, continuing the journey towards recognition, justice, and development in Asia and the Pacific region. This event is organized by the alumni from the Asia-Pacific region of the Fellowship Program for People of African Descent. It will start at 12:30 in this same room. So do your best to be part of the event, please. Okay? Thank you.
Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Marie-Joseph Faissi. I've been asked to chair the meeting this afternoon. Therefore, I declare the 4th meeting of the regional meeting for Asia and the Pacific region on the decade open. For the next hour and a half, we'll continue our discussion under the panel discussion on development. And for that, I'm happy to give the floor to Ms. Hongjiang Huang, member of the United Nations Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, who is the moderator of this panel discussion. Mr. Huang, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, for the second part of our panel discussion, I have the pleasure to introduce 3 distinguished panelists. On my right side, Ms. Dahlia Ducreay from the Commonwealth of Dominica has a decade of practical experience in the People's Republic of China. It's my home country. Ms. Ducreay is head of the international department at the Silk Road Youth Forum, a non-governmental organization dedicated to youth development within the Belt and Road Initiative. In this role, she facilitates an international platform for knowledge-sharing activities projects among the Belt and Road countries, contributing to fostering connections and promoting youth development. For her work, Ms. Ducreay received the award of the most influential person of African descent in the humanitarian and education field by IDPAD, Hongjiang. The next panelist I would like to introduce is Ms. Choi, and she's the senior lecturer at the Massey University in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where she teaches political theory and international relations. Her research has focused on international relations of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and other areas, including non-Western international relations theory, Inter-Asia and Afro-Asia nexus, and post-colonial and feminist theories. Her current book-length research examines Asia-Africa relations through North Korea culture, diplomacy projects, and political theory. She co-edits the book series, Creative Interventions in Global Politics, and serves as co-editor-in-chief of International Feminist Journal of Politics, 2022 to 2025. And the third panelist I would like to introduce is Professor Bonny Ibhawoh. I think he'll be online, right? Yeah, from Nigeria. And he is member of the United Nations ASPER mechanism on the right to development. Professor Ibhawoh is Professor and Senator William McMaster Chair in Global Human Rights at McMaster University, Canada, and founding director of the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice. Previously, he was a Human Rights Fellow at the Carnegie's Council for Ethics and International Affairs in New York, and Research Fellow at the Danish Institute for Human Rights in Copenhagen. His research expertise include global human rights history, peace and conflict studies, and transnational and restorative justice studies. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to give the floor to our first panelist, Ms. Dahlia Ducreay. Madam, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. I would first like to ask the Secretariat to allow me access to the PPT, please. To know thyself is to know your worth. Before I begin, allow me to acknowledge my ancestors, the Kalinago people, the native indigenous people of the Commonwealth of Dominica, and the West African slaves who were transported to the Caribbean. For without them, I would not be here. Mabrika, Sakafet, Nya Dapa, hello, salut, and ni hao. Distinguished leaders, ladies and gentlemen, first allow me to extend my thanks to the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the invitation to participate and share my insights during this much anticipated regional meeting for Asia and the Pacific region on the International Decade for People of African Descent. These 2 days serve as an essential knowledge bank of information for not only the development growth of people of African descent over the past decade, but also a framework to guide the next decade of global development. As we delve deeper into the impact of the Africa-China cooperation and the African diaspora, with a specific focus on youth development, it becomes imperative to closely examine the Africa-China education plan and its pivotal role in shaping the destiny of the youth in the Belt and Road member countries. Before we proceed, let us take a moment to reflect on the broader theme of our discussion, beyond borders, fostering economic, social, and cultural rights in Africa-China cooperation, with a focus on youth and development. This theme encapsulates the essence of our exploration today, emphasizing the interconnectedness of economic, social, and cultural rights in the context of the collaboration between Africa and China, particularly as it relates to the youth. The last decade has witnessed a transformative period in global dynamics, marked by the rise of the Belt and Road Initiative. This initiative has become a symbol of connectivity, facilitating infrastructural development and economic collaboration between China and developing nations. As we celebrate the 10th year of the International Decade for People of African Descent, it is crucial to assess the impact of BRI on fostering economic, social, and cultural rights in the Africa-China partnership. Of course, I will stress again, with a keen focus on African youth and youth from the African diaspora in China. Common challenges that arise with initiatives like BRI are finding a balance between national identity and globalization. It is not uncommon for Africans and youth from the African diaspora to feel misplaced in a society that is predominantly Asian, just by the simple visual fact that your presence will always stand out. It is equally not uncommon for a society of one ethnic background to need time to adjust to the impacts of globalization. However, regardless of that fact, a steady increase can be observed over the past decade. For example, in youth exchange programs between African and Chinese youth to foster mutual cultural understanding. This is an example of one such youth exchanges organized by my department quarterly. Education opportunities such as the African Talents Program to provide more education opportunities. Again, this is another example of work that my department does in being a part of the solutions. It is not a perfect system, but we do what we can where we are. Entrepreneurship and innovation, such as startup incubators, innovation hubs, and collaborative hubs to foster creativity and economic innovation among African youth. These are examples of annual competitions, entrepreneurship contributions on a national level that has been hosted in China, but also at grassroots level as well, this has happened. This is an example of one of the most famous representative of entrepreneurship and innovation for African people in China, promoting China-Africa entrepreneurship in the famous Changsha region. Coupled with lessons learned through defining moments of global partnerships, it was recognized the importance of inclusive initiatives to promote the overall success of the BRI initiative. And just to take a pause from my prepared speech, I would also like to respond to the comment that was made about the word inclusiveness, how it's being used. Yes, it is a fact. This word is maybe overused, but in situations like this, we are using it, at least for my department. That is our focal point, inclusiveness, using my platform to create more opportunities for everyone to grow, to develop. So the essence of inclusiveness is practiced, at least for my department. It's not perfect, but step by step, we will get there. From a macro point of view, the African and the youth from the African diaspora have been provided many opportunities to thrive in China via government scholarships, skills development training programs, and knowledge sharing initiatives among African and Chinese higher education institutes. The impact of these initiatives has resulted in the People's Republic of China steadily becoming the #1 destination to pursue higher education, especially on the African continent. However, it can be equally argued that the reasons for this drastic increase in youth mobility to China are largely due to the youth being impressed by the rapid growth of the Chinese economy and the low cost of education. My journey, like that of many other African and African descent youth in China, serves as a microcosm of the broader narrative. The unique historical diplomatic ties between Africa and China dating back to the 1950s, and many of our panelists have really mentioned this pinnacle moment in the 1950s. As you can see, the Bandung Conference. The complex interplay of these relationships, both in Africa and in the diaspora, set the stage for the developments we witness today. The 1950s also witnessed the first 4 African students from Egypt being invited to pursue their education in China. The challenges faced by these 4 students, which included language barrier, cultural and custom shock, are the same challenges still faced today. The same question remains: how can a nation balance globalization aspiration while also maintaining national identity? As compared to the 1950s, the Chinese society of today is more open and internationalized. And the question that I asked just a while ago, I would love to hear from my fellow panelists and the participants. How can a nation balance globalization aspiration while also maintaining national identity? I would love to hear your thoughts in the sharing session of our session. In the diaspora, particularly in regions like the Caribbean, where I am from, the historical presence of Chinese merchants as an alternative to former African slave workers is a testament to the multifaceted nature of the relationship the African diaspora has with China. Today, this relationship has evolved into a dynamic force shaping the economic, social, and cultural landscapes of both regions. The concept of development, as we understand it today, is deeply intertwined with the human and planetary experience. It is no longer solely based on the GDP of a nation. In this context, to address the challenges facing development, skills development and targeted education must be at the forefront of human capital development. Development must now translate to the current needs of the society. As we enter a new year and a decade, the Belt and Road Initiative, with its emphasis on building soft and hard infrastructures, has triggered a discernible shift in the development capacities of numerous countries worldwide. With this shift, the role of the African youth becomes even more crucial. As a vast majority of the countries on the African continent are active members of the BRI initiative, Africa, a continent rich with natural resources, also contains the world's largest youth population. In the next 10 years, training received by these youth will determine the course of the continent and extension of the world. The Africa-China Education Plan over the past decade has played a pivotal role in the development with the yearly increase in the government scholarships provided by the Chinese government. Myself and my colleagues from China in attendance are all recipients of Chinese education. Although the system is not perfect, it is undeniable that due to the opportunities presented in a society like China, we have been able to capitalize on market trends to achieve many milestones in our lives, contributing to our respective countries' youth development. This success can also be attributed to an individual's personality traits and their innate skill to adapt. Looking back, the decade from 2013 to 2023 witnessed what can be termed an African awareness gold rush in China. This period marked a transformative shift in the Chinese market, underpinned by the encouragement of the government to focus on Africa-centric entrepreneurial endeavors under the flagship of the Belt and Road Initiative. African youth and youth from the African diaspora, myself included, seized the opportunities presented during this period to be bridges in the form of translators, consultants, and guides, combining local knowledge with technical skills acquired. From skills development training to increased access to job opportunities under the Belt and Road Initiative focused on China-Africa, the impact of the Belt and Road was palpable at the grassroots level. Business ventures sought African youth as bridges between nations, promoting cross-cultural exchange and collaboration. Additionally, the introduction of education programs and grants specifically tailored for African youth was closely aligned with the Africa-China Education Plan to encourage more youth to obtain a tertiary education. This plan aimed not only to enhance academic pursuits, but also to foster a deeper understanding and appreciation of the diverse cultures, histories, and experiences of both Africa and China. To date, in order to encourage continued cross-cultural exchange, as head of the International Department at the Silk Road Youth Forum, my department hosts several knowledge-sharing programs, projects, partnering with embassies, international and local agencies, and universities to allow incoming youth to have access to up-to-date learning opportunities, while also highlighting the progress of existing youth in China. As we transition in the new decade, it is crucial to address the sustained impact of these initiatives. The collaborative efforts between Africa and China have not only paved the way for economic growth, but have also contributed to a more profound cultural exchange, promoting mutual understanding and appreciation. However, this progress experienced a challenging era, which was during the COVID-19 pandemic. It is a fact that there were issues that happened in that era. But what I would like to focus on was what happened in that era between the communities to find a solution, in addressing the solution. African and youth from the African diaspora working together with their embassy counterparts and the Chinese government on strategies to enhance the African youth experience has become essential to the re-strengthening of ties with China. Organizations like my colleagues at IDPAD and other grassroots level has been pivotal in pushing that agenda. Now, I see that I have just one more limit left. I would like to highlight those grassroots level organizations. Like I mentioned before, in that period in time and then after this Africa Day celebration was just after the COVID-19 period. And it is a testament that the diaspora, along with the group of African ambassadors in Beijing, with the support of relevant Chinese government officials, came together to celebrate that culture, that awareness, pushing that representation in China, even after that challenging period. So it gives hope that it can be done. We can work together. Now, before I end of my presentation, I would like to share some practical solutions that my department has done regarding supporting learning opportunities of youth, African youth, and African descent youth in China. We partner with local universities. We partner with respective youth unions of all African countries based in China to stay up to date on the challenges that they face while tracking their development progress. We partner with heads of mission and international organizations to form a network of skilled individuals thriving in China. And I'm so happy to see different youth from the Asia Pacific, which gives me an opportunity to extend that network, to give more access to those youth to learn more. The more you're connected, the more you know what to do and learn from each other. Knowledge is power. Lastly, I know moderator is being so nice to me at the moment, so I do not want to push my luck. So I will end with just a highlighted video of our last activity that we did. And there it goes. I'm not too sure how to just click it. I suppose we click. Okay. My department believes that we not only focus on African youth and youth of African descent, but we focus on Belt and Road youth, their experiences, and including the Chinese youth in that conversation. Thank you so much for this time, and I look forward to that.
Thank you, Dahlia, for this very interesting and insightful presentations, and you share with us a lot of information regarding not only the work done by your department, but also the exchange, education exchange between China and Africa, and also other countries along the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is really wonderful. And I think you said it right. Knowledge is power, and we would see that more this kind of program and activities and projects will be carried out between Asian Pacific countries and African countries, and also the people of African descent in this region. Thank you, Madam. And next, I will give the floor to our next panelist, Ms. Shine Choi. Yeah, sorry for the pronunciation. Yeah,
no, it's okay.
You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I have my slide up, please? Thank you. So maybe before I start talking about, and I'm not going to go through my written statement, but just make one point, which is for me, anti-racist cooperation is really actually about liberation, right? So thinking a little bit about, I'm not talking about solidarity, Afro-Asian solidarity, but thinking about it only makes sense, right? Afro-Asian, any relation only makes sense when we fundamentally, specifically, and personally understand how my liberation is linked to your liberation, right? And to understand it intellectually and to live it and put it in practice are two different things, because the structures of power and the structures of privilege and who gets awarded and what kind of acts are recognized and what kind of acts will never be recognized, right, are just so built into the existing contemporary structure that it takes a lot. It takes a lot of soul searching, it takes a lot of rule breaking, it takes a lot of mistakes and errors and discomfort to learn even actually what it means to learn from the African diaspora, to think about how our liberations are interconnected. And so I'm not talking about national liberation. I mean, I'm not a historian. I'm a feminist scholar. I'm asking about what actually is liberation, and what actually are these categories of race, gender, and class. We talk about intersectionality of these social categories, but these social categories are counter concepts that are meant to make the systems of domination and exploitation visible. These are not meant to enclose who we are, right? Social formations are things that we need to break, right? So my understanding about, for example, liberation and gender and feminism is to say, well, what exactly is the relationship between gender and feminism? I don't take that as a given. The point of feminism is liberation. The point of anti-colonialism and anti-racist politics is not to keep the category of race, but to break away from the hierarchical nature of race as an analytical category. So the counter is not enough in liberation, right? The counter sentence and counter theory is not important. So my written statement talks through what that means theoretically, what it means in terms of my own research. But I also wanted to just say one more thing about, it might be a bit perplexing for people in the room, like why does someone who works on North Korea, which is a political term, right? The term North and South Korea are political terms. These are not actually existing terms or names that the states themselves use, right? So when I talk about North Korea, I use small n and k, small k, to kind of highlight that actually we're talking about peoplehood, right? And the question of divided Korea, right, is integral to thinking a little bit about how maybe Asia and the Pacific is not decolonized, right? The fact that the Korean War is ongoing and the Korean peninsula is divided, right, highlights the fact that, and the fact that DPRK is known as North Korea, right? All of these actually highlight the fact that we have a long way to go to actually experience what it means to live the reality of non-aligned movement, which is actually about fundamentally democratizing international relations. I don't think we're actually living in that reality, right? And so why did I turn to Africa, right? As someone who specializes in North Korea and international relations. In part, it comes from the conclusion of my first book, where I looked at how a country like North Korea always remains an object of international action. It remains an international problem, both in human rights, security, and development, right? And for me, I wanted to move away from the Cold War binary that constructs North Korea as an other. And I was looking for, as a South Korean citizen, I can't travel to North Korea. If you're American passport holder or whatever, you can travel, right? I mean, you could have traveled at certain moments, but as a South Korean passport holder, I can't, right? So I was trying to figure out, how do I get to know this Cold War other? How do I move away from the dominant narratives about North Korea? How do I, and so for me, the revelation that North Korea has this long history, right, of cultural diplomacy in the global south and in Southeast Asia and in Africa, and that they have built these national monument projects, right? So these were for me entryways into thinking about, okay, so these are new places for me to encounter North Korea in a way that might actually give me access to the maybe unrealized, right, realities of what it means to struggle for liberation and what it means what does an anti-racist cooperation actually looks like, right? So that's kind of where, I'm not going to talk about my research, but that's kind of where I was going with. So I traveled to Zimbabwe, Namibia, Angola, Senegal, as part of my effort to because I didn't want to just look at the archives, right? I wanted to understand, well, what do these monuments look like? What am I going to find? What kind of encounters would I have in these sites where I have no business being, right? And I'm not an Africanist, right? And so so thinking a little bit about what does it mean, thinking about like, what happens? What would happen if I went to the North Korean built African Renaissance statue in Dakar, Senegal? What kind of people am I going to meet, and what kind of conversations am I going to have, right? So that was kind of structuring my experimentation with thinking a little bit about trying to be in places and in being in conversation with people that I am supposedly have no business being in conversation with. And North Korea provided me, North Korea cultural diplomacy provided me that entry point. And so through that, I've been thinking about how, in thinking about issues of anti-racist cooperation and how do we realize the right of development of people of African descent in the Asia and the Pacific, Claudia Jones has been a very important thinker. So Claudia Jones, what's important about it is she asked the question, what does integration really mean? Integration, that is democratic integration, means breaking down the fetters that prohibit the full economic, political, and social participation of our people in all phases of American life. This does not mean that a merger or an assimilative process necessarily takes place. In general, the struggle for integration waged today by our people is directed toward achieving equal rights, economic, political, and social. So I think what's important about this insight is it's not assuming that that integration is oppositional to self-determination, right? And thinking about how liberation and equal rights, wherever there's violation of equal rights, there's a violation of the right to self-determination. And I think that's a very important point to think about. The other reason that Claudia Jones is important in the context of Korean Peninsula is her position on the Korean War. And thinking about the link between the Korean War and racism. I've talked about some of these things already in my remarks. But I also think the larger insight here is her conceptual and analytical contribution. For example, around this point that when Black women's situation is advanced, so will the entire social structure. Right? So that's kind of how she understood the issue, the project, the struggle of liberation. And here what's important is that actually what she's highlighting is that when the super exploitative structure, right, is something that we no longer accept, then actually when we talk about equal rights and self-determination, we're actually talking about fundamental transformative, right, reform. And so anti-racist cooperation is always fundamentally going to be a transformative political project. And in this sense, I think it's also important to, at this particular point where the concept of intersectionality is something that is almost being mainstreamed, like gender is being mainstreamed. It's important to turn to Jones's work, because when she talks about triple oppression of gender, class, and race, what's important is what she's saying is that actually these are categories that might not be necessarily helpful. They might flatten out our analysis. And so in the context of the Caribbean, she talks about how maybe the triple oppression is, as a woman, as mothers, and as colonials, subjected in indignities and great suffering because of the status of their countries, right? So thinking a little bit more about how we need to kind of unpack and try to better understand what the triple oppression actually looks like in different localities and contexts is of importance, rather than simply deploying gender, sex, race, and class in sort of like blunt ways that we do in theory. The other point that I think is important about starting with Jones's work through in the context of Korea is the history of U.S. military in the Korean Peninsula. So what's important here is, in some ways, Christine Hong's work echoes what Jones has said in critique of the Korean War as a bestial war, or the U.S. imperial war. And here what she's highlighting is the fact that the prevailing anti-Black racism in Korea has particular histories that's linked to the the racial tensions, right, between white and African-American GIs, right? So it's actually linked to the issue of U.S. military bases in South Korea. So a lot of the prevailing notions, I mean, we've talked about it in this room from yesterday, and Sam has really illuminated us on the kind of both direct and indirect, conscious and unconscious assumptions, right? People make the stereotype, the racial stereotyping. What's important here is that actually this myth, right, that Korea is racially a homogeneous society is actually imploded when we turn to the fact that, for example, to the story of An Sung-ja, who is born out of a Korean sex worker and African-American GI, right? So in some ways, what her story highlights is that no language proficiency, familiarity with Korean language, a society, and the fact that she is Korean and a talented dancer and singer, right? None of these things will ensure that she is accepted by the Korean society, right? And so actually what we're talking about is the issue of stigma, right? And how certain bodies are stigmatized. And there is the important attention that we need to talk about the racialized ways in which certain bodies get stigmatized, and how racism can also gain articulation through non-raced discourse, because it's so naturalized. The hierarchy of insider and outsider is so naturalized. So for me, the issue of racism and anti-Black racism in the context of South Korea is actually not just only about the issue of racial homogeneity, the myth of racial homogeneous society, but the myth of homogeneity, right? And homogeneity is created through neoliberalism, right? So it's actually an issue of capitalism, right? So I'm thinking a little bit about when everyone is acting like there's only one way of doing things, or there's only one normal way of going through the normal educational system, or X, Y, and Z, we know that is a construct of power, right? So for me, the issue of racism is it's so fundamental, right? We have to look at the racist discourse as well as the non-raced discourses to fundamentally question this assumption that society can ever be homogeneous. Thank you. So that's the important point. And the other thing I wanted to highlight that which haven't really been discussed is that in the work that Rita Udor and Sharon Yoon have done, and this is based on Rita Udor's PhD thesis that is coming out of the Ibhawoh Women's University in Seoul. And their finding is really, really important, right? So I'm just going to read it. So Africans in Korea are in reality diverse in terms of their schooling, gender, and legal statuses. Structural forces create an environment that is inhospitable for those lying outside of boundaries of this stereotype. 3D, dirty, difficult, dangerous jobs. And thus, there is a tendency for those who stay in Korea to be a particular demographic. And I will go further than what they say. The structure creates this demographic, right? And this is something that Anthony I see you there, was talking about in his presentation, right? And so this is exactly what is happening in Korea. And the larger point I want to make is that racism in Korea, oftentimes scholars, because we look at the Asian migration, right? Oftentimes Asia is the sending country and the receiving country, right? The scholars have focused on how maybe racism in Korea in Asia doesn't actually happen through colorism, so phenotypical features. But actually when we turn to the experiences of children, of youth, refugees in Korea, what it highlights is that it actually does, right? It actually does in so fundamental way, and I've translated bits where it's in the racialized language. But what's important here is what's happening here is not just colorism, but ideas and images about Africa that is in some ways reproducing Western narratives about Africa. Right? And so really what we're talking about, what needs to happen in the context of Korea and in Asia and the Pacific, is the de-imperialization of our imagination about places that may feel distant. Right? So this idea that Africa is a distant place itself is a racist idea, right? Because distance, right? What actually is distance, right? Distance is saying, well, they don't matter, right? They're not as relevant. Right? And distance, when my students in New Zealand talk about distance, oh, well, why are we studying Angela Davis's work? Why are we studying Audre Lorde? Why are we studying, talking about, race in the New Zealand context? It's an American category. It's an American problem. What I highlight to them is that actually, where does this idea come from, right? In the context of New Zealand, where it's a settler colonial state, and the invisible white African migration is happening, and that is structuring the whiteness and the white supremacist notions in New Zealand. So distance, the idea that Africa is a distant issue, is a racist notion, right? So I'm just going to stop there, and hope we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Choi, for your insightful research on this topic. Actually, I would say it's a little bit distant from what we discussed in the panel, right? And in other topics. But I think your research in terms of the Cold War ideology and also the kind of category that has been developed by the colonial power, maybe you can say that, is something new to me, but I think participants would may make some comments later on your presentation. Thank you, Madam. And next, I would like to give the floor to our next panelist, Professor Bonny Ibhawoh. Are you online?
Yes, I'm online.
Good morning. Thank you. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, delegates and friends. I'm delighted to join you this morning. It's morning here in Ontario, Canada. My remarks will continue with the theme of development that guides this panel. I will be speaking about racial discrimination as an obstacle to the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, including the right to development. Although I'm a professor here of human rights here in Canada, I also sit on the UN expert mechanism on the right to development in the office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So I will be bringing that perspective to the question of racism and how it intersects with the operationalization of the right to development. So I want to start by just acknowledging that there is a fundamental link between racism and the enjoyment of economic and social and cultural rights. Economic, social, and cultural rights are also central to the right to development agenda. Similarly, anti-racism, non-discrimination, and the equality of opportunity for development are obviously key pillars of the right to development, and of course also the Sustainable Development Goals. The Declaration on the Right to Development, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1986, explicitly enjoins states to take resolute steps to eliminate the violations of human rights of people affected by racism and racial discrimination. My expert mechanism, the expert mechanism on the right to development, has identified racism and racial discrimination as key obstacles to the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights provisions of the Declaration on the Declaration on the Right to Development and other economic and social rights provision in other international human rights laws, and notably the Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. On the theme of, in a thematic study on racism, racial discrimination, and the right to development, presented to the Human Rights Council in 2002, my expert mechanism noted that although racism and racial discrimination have been long-standing issues on the UN human rights agenda, they continue to stand as significant obstacle to the enjoyment of human rights by millions of people all over the world. Across the world, the marginalized and racialized communities are demanding racial equality and anti-racist interventions from states, regional and international organizations. These demands call for renewed focus on global efforts to combat racism. So, for example, the Human Rights Advisory Committee has noted in its recent report on racial equality that the time has come to embrace more decisive policies and means to bring about racial equality in a sustainable manner at both national and international levels. The Right to Development agenda recognizes that racism, racial discrimination, and racial injustice are clear violations of fundamental human rights. Racism and racial discrimination rationalize the hierarchical domination of one racial or ethnic group over others, and maintain social and material advantages for the dominant group while reproducing adverse outcomes for those who are marginalized. Racism, as we know, is also linked to state violence, a lack of economic opportunity, poverty, unemployment, health disparities, all of which impinge on the fulfillment of the right to development. I'll now say something briefly about the historical connections between the Right to Development agenda and the struggle for racial inclusion. The Declaration on the Right to Development agenda emerged in the context of the global struggle against racial discrimination in the post-colonial and post-imperial United Nations of the 1960s and 70s. The newly independent, formerly colonized states of Africa and Asia were the leading advocates of the right to development at the United Nations. These newly independent countries in Asia and Africa began to push for an international human rights order that went beyond just the narrow focus on civil and political rights, but also a more comprehensive human rights agenda that included economic, social, and cultural rights. Political leaders in Asian and African countries demanded a new and just international economic order that is conducive to the development of the newly independent, formerly colonized states. These political leaders were also concerned about practices of racial discrimination that had sustained colonialism. So from its inception, the Right to Development agenda was simultaneously linked with the struggle for economic and social rights and the struggle for racial equality. So from the very beginning, these two principal human rights goals intersected in the Right to Development agenda. This link between economic and social rights on one hand and the quest for racial equality and justice on the other hand is quite evident in the declaration itself. So the Declaration on the Right to Development, it's one of the few human rights documents of the United Nations that explicitly links racism with the denial of economic, social, and cultural rights opportunity. The Declaration provides a roadmap for promoting justice and dignity for all and combating racism in all its manifestations through what is called the Equality of Opportunity for Development principle. The Declaration affirms that equality of opportunity for development is both a prerogative of nations and of individuals who make up that nation. Central to this right is the goal of eliminating historical and systemic obstacles that impede development in many regions of the world. As outlined in the preambular section, the preambular paragraph of the Declaration on the Right to Development, the obstacles to be eliminated include the massive and flagrant violations of human rights of peoples and individuals affected by situations such as those resulting from colonialism, neocolonialism, apartheid, all forms of racism and racial discrimination, foreign domination, occupation, aggression and threats against national sovereignty, national unity, territorial integrity, and threats of war. What I just read are the direct language of the Declaration on the Right to Development. So if you go to the Declaration on the Right to Development, you will find these exact words that I just read. The need to eliminate all forms of discrimination related to neocolonialism, colonialism, apartheid, racial discrimination, occupation, aggression, foreign domination, national sovereignty. All these terms are embedded in the Declaration on the Right to Development. So the Right to Development agenda is very forward-thinking in how it positions racism in relation to the fulfillment of economic and social rights. The Declaration also reinforces this point by enjoining states to take steps to eradicate the violations of human rights of people affected by racism and racial discrimination. The elimination of racism through the principle of equality of opportunity for development is therefore recognized as essential to fulfilling the right to development. There is a recognition in the Declaration on the Right to Development that racism and racial discrimination are barriers to the operationalization of human rights at both national level and international level. So this is a very important dimension of the Right to Development agenda. At a national level, racism fractures the social cohesion of societies, impacts the well-being of vulnerable groups. Racial prejudice and systemic discrimination affect the well-being of racialized groups and deny them equitable access to social services, health, education, social protection, economic opportunities, justice, safety, and security. And we've had some personal experiences of all of these during this session. At an international level, racism and racial discrimination can result in the deprivation of transnational economic opportunities for individuals and of foreign direct investments and relief from debt for developing countries. Discrimination based on national origins, ethnicity, and religion limits the freedom of individuals to migrate for better opportunities or to access better educational and economic opportunities outside their country of origin. I will now spend a few minutes left to talk about some of the findings of our recent study, a study by my mechanism on the intersection between racial discrimination and the right to development. The study of my expert mechanism on this intersection between racism and the right to development shows that racial disparities and inequalities are evident in many developmental areas, including access to quality education, employment, justice, health, social security, and many others. And I'll speak just briefly on two or three of them. On access to health, for example, our study found a negative relationship between racism and individual and communal health and well-being, which are integral goals of the Right to Development agenda. Racial discriminations and disparities were prevalent within healthcare systems in many states, and racism influences health throughout one's lifespan. We note that several UN organs have recognized and urged action over this evidence that there are severe health status disadvantages for marginalized ethnic and racial groups in many countries. On the right to employment, our study established that in many states around the world, racism and racial discrimination exclude people from sustained and gainful employment, as well as being experienced at work through unfair treatment and harassment. Although many states have now enacted laws prohibiting discrimination in employment, instances of race-based discrimination remain pervasive and well documented. And again, we had very disturbing personal stories throughout the session of the experience of persons of African descent experiencing labor discrimination. And so we also see this in housing and healthcare. Legal remedies against discrimination do not always ensure equal employment or access to healthcare. In some states, in fact, non-discrimination and equal opportunity laws are either non-existent or inadequately enforced. In other countries, well-meaning affirmative action measures aimed at addressing long-standing racial disparities in employment are beginning to face stiff political opposition from dominant groups, thereby hindering social and economic inclusion. There is a rollback of equity and diversity and inclusion initiatives in many states around the world. Race-based employment discrimination undermines the principle of the equality of opportunity for development and remains a significant obstacle to fulfilling the Right to Development agenda. I'll now conclude by just highlighting a key theme that has emerged from our study. A key theme that emerged from our mechanism study on racism and the right to development is the absence or inadequacy of indicators for assessing racial discrimination and the effectiveness of national and international anti-racism laws, policies, and programs. So, for example, our understanding of the links between race and health status, between race and vulnerability to disease, race and gender, race and poverty remains very limited by the lack of disaggregated information of race. So many states are not collecting the kind of data we require to make policy interventions in this area. And of course, the excuse is always that collecting racial data would undermine the national unity and social cohesion, and it would create some kind of tension within the body politic. We disagree with that proposition. We think that race-based data are essential if we are to address the systemic issues we've identified throughout this session. Conclusively, in the efforts to address these gaps and challenges, citizens and civil society organizations must play a crucial role in holding governments and international organizations accountable to their human rights obligations and commitments to non-discrimination and equality of opportunity for development using UN mechanisms. The Right to Development Agenda provides an advocacy framework for addressing the many challenges of racism and racial discrimination that we have identified at this session and that continue to pose a big risk and an obstacle to the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights for individuals and communities worldwide. I thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Ibhawoh. Yeah, I appreciate your insightful presentation, including your contribution to the adoption of the Declaration on the Rights to Development, and your interpretation as well as your insight on how member states, including civil societies, can work together to push for a further improvement and progress on the implementation of the rights to development is relevant and important. And I think your observation on the absence of the disaggregated data is also repeated many times by other panelists and also in the last 2 days and also in other forums. And I believe that the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent in our third session in April this year will continue to call for this initiative, which should be undertaken by member states as soon as possible. And Professor, I thank you for your contribution and active participation. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard the presentation by the three excellent panelists, and now it's time for member states and participants in the room and also online to have your comments and questions. Now, member states first, 2 minutes each. Any member states? Yes? Oh yeah, Indonesia, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, moderator. Indonesia views today's meeting alongside the preceding regional meetings as integral to the implementation of the International Decade for People of African Descent. We believe that the discussion since yesterday has provided a unique platform to emphasize the substantial contributions of individuals of African descent and to champion their equitable access to the full spectrum of human rights. Now, in light of time, we have a written statement that we will upload later and we will send to the Secretariat. But now please allow me to read 3 key points that we would like to raise in this panel. First, we wish to echo the sentiments expressed by our esteemed colleagues, including some panelists, previously on the endurance of, or the importance to maintain Asia-Africa solidarity, which stemmed from the historic Asia-Africa Conference in 1955. I think we believe it is central coming from the Bandung Principle, which is the pursuit of economic growth and development that leaves no one behind. We believe this principle includes the right to development for both Africans and people of African descent in the Asia and Pacific region. Second, it is essential to recognize that the challenges faced by people of African descent in the Asia-Pacific region vary widely from one country to another and even within different communities. So these challenges, I think, can be both systemic and societal in nature that hinder equitable economic access, among others. Thus, we believe that addressing the barriers requires a multifaceted approach, which include legal reforms, awareness campaigns, education, and community engagement. I think these issues have been discussed in previous panel too. Now, third, as Ambassador Chanta Langsi from ICHR has highlighted in previous discussion too, that numerous countries in Southeast Asia have taken significant steps to enhance their anti-discrimination policies, and Indonesia is no exception. Over the years, we have taken steps to promote racial and ethnic equality, including for migrants and refugees of African descent. We continue to strengthen our anti-discrimination laws and improve the education system to nurture tolerance and understanding, which I think very important, especially in light of a very rapid development of online technology. Lastly, we want to underscore the importance of cooperation with international organizations and local NGOs. For example, in Indonesia, we have cooperation with the IOM, UNSCR, local governments, and NGOs to provide support and prevent any discrimination against migrants and refugees. In closing, we would like to reaffirm our commitment to ensure that people of African descent have equal access to opportunities, justice, and development. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Indonesia, for your remarks and also your commitment regarding the member states, or including other members, in facilitating the anti-racism and anti-discrimination policies and programs. Thank you. And any next one? Okay, if not further member state? Okay, now other participants. Yeah, Sammy, you have the floor.
Thank
Lady
you.
first, so sorry.
Yeah, for me, this issue of development is, it touches the soul. And I just want to say that, ask you, the leaders, to maybe when you go and talk to the heads of states, I don't know, I'm from Zimbabwe personally, and in Zimbabwe, we've got the policy that was put called Look East policy. And in that policy, it was more like there was that drive to say, Zimbabweans, you're okay to go to Asia, you know, whether you've got your qualifications, you've got what. They made us believe that it was so possible to leave our countries to go and work in Asia. Why? Because there's that cooperation. But when we get there, you know, my fellow said this, that, you know, we start to hear like, oh, you're black, oh, you. So the leaders, maybe they do have good intentions when they have these MOUs and sign, but it's not happening. Because when they sign, they take pictures, put in newspapers, it's all over the news, like, oh, we've made partnership with this country, it's okay for you guys to go. And definitely because we believe we're now living in a global society, there's globalization, it's okay for me to grab my bag and my kids and say, we're gonna make it in that country. But when I get there, with maybe a 1-month visa, hoping when I get there, I have all the qualifications that I needed, I'll get the job, and then I'm told no. So that means they're lying to us. So I do understand the cooperation, I do understand the paperwork, I do understand the optics, but they should understand that they are playing with people's lives. If it's not possible to accept people from another country, please don't give them visas. Do not. You know what? I would rather go to the embassy and not get a visa and be stuck in my country than you say to me, it's okay to come to my land, you can get a job, and when I get there, you start telling me I'm black. I know I'm black, I know I'm African, but you invited me, right? So I'm asking if you can, I wish I had that platform to speak to the heads of state myself.
Thank you for your comment, and also, yeah, your call for concrete action. Any other? Okay. I see many hands, I know. Okay, one by one. Ambassador, maybe. Yeah, Ambassador first. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I wish to react to this comment, the latest comment. I think that nothing is granted, and our world, we are living not in black and white. You may recall that, you know, not only the African going anywhere having and facing, you know, discrimination, bad comment, bad mouth, etc., but the vice versa is also valid. I recall living in France, operating in France and during the COVID. Whenever we are moving in town, they call it COVID, COVID coming. So this is a fact of life, and we have to live with it. But the most important is we have to, wherever we go, and we meaning that the community, I'm talking about the community, the entity, we have to promote ourselves. We have to prove to the host that we are valid, we have value, we are ready to share, and we do have capacity to bring a plus. I wish to share with you one thing. To the extent that, you know, the high leadership of China, once upon a time, has to call the Chinese overseas all over the world to adopt a low-profile attitude, because too much propaganda on them, and everybody is talking about invasion or the Chinese going everywhere, you know. And this is a fact that merits our reflection. Why the high leadership of China has to go for this appeal? Because they also know that, you know, over comment may also backfire the whole community. Therefore, I think that, you know, we have to put on the weight and see how to promote our community in appropriate term and condition, and not too much and not too low. And not only the Chinese community, but, you know, the Asian in general, all over the world. Whenever we go, we are seen as, we are viewed as hardworking people, serious, very entrepreneurship, very good traders, etc., etc. I think that, you know, this kind of image we have to project to ourselves. But I do share with our friend from Africa, because, you know, the prototype is there. Sometimes, you know, by ignorance, many people, not only in Asia, but including in Europe, whenever they are talking about Nigeria, they are thinking of, you know, scamming, etc., etc. And this is a very bad image which affects the whole African community, own nation from Africa. So I think that this is also one thing that we have to work on in order to project a better image and try to correct, you know, the erroneous view, which really, you know, deeply enrooted, you know, in the mind of people. And this is the comment I wish to share with our African friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. Yeah, due to we're running out of time, but I think we will try to have 2 more questions, and we also need to leave floor to the panelists for further comments, and also 1 question from online participants. So 2 more in the room. So maybe 1 on the left, 1 on the right. The front, okay, 1 in the front. Okay, Madam, you have the floor. Thank you.
Just for the benefit of those who may have joined us today, my name is Associate Professor Mimi Claudine Watts, Federation University, Australia, and Chair African Science Research Innovation Council, African Union Commission, the Australian chapter. I guess I've got a comment and a question. So to Professor Choi, thank you so much, but also to all the participants for your really insightful presentations, really informative. You know, the work that you're doing with North Korea, Professor Shine, Choi, and Africa, it is an interesting intersection. And one of the things you talked about was the phenotypical discussion around the perception of Africa through the lens, but and the white and blackness in terms of race relationships. But when you look at your work, which focuses on the political history and the political policy relationships, analysis, etc., I wonder what you have found in terms of that work to strengthen maybe relationships between the continent of Africa, and you did choose not to use the terms North Korea and South Korea. So maybe I say, and the Koreas in that work. And how do you see the future for Africa or specific countries that you have been in or working with, and the Koreas as combined in one? So I would really like maybe to get your insight into that. And for Ms. Ducreay, thank you so much for another really wonderful presentation in terms of the relationship between China and Africa, but also the numbers that you shared in terms of the number of scholarships that are presented to African students to study in China. They really provided insight into the opportunities that are made available through education. And in terms of that, I know the ambassador just highlighted how the world, there is that lens of invasion, but then we turn around and we see the opportunities like that in terms of almost like a balanced type of equal relationship, partnership between China and the continent. How do you again see how that narrative in terms of it's about invasion, the Silk Road and all the politics around it and the taking over of countries. So through your work, how has that been defined, and how do you see maybe the narrative being changed or improved, and what is the reality on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam, for your questions. And I think I will give the floor to the panelists in a moment. Maybe I will take more questions, and so that we would give some time for the panelists to prepare to answer the questions. Yeah. Okay. So you have the floor. And I would take more, but be brief, okay? Brief. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. My question is primarily directed to Ms. Ducreay and also to the moderator somehow. It's a comment and a question. You know, Afro-Asian solidarity has always been built on a common resistance to colonialism in the past and neo-colonialism in the present. However, the Silk Road is increasingly becoming controversial. China-African partnership has been structured as a win-win engagement with the intensification of the Look East policies of a good number of African states and China's interest in the natural resources of Africa. We have to acknowledge the great strides in infrastructural development witnessed across the African continent as a result of Chinese investment and technology. This is true. However, we must also recognize the tension in this relationship and the perception in some quarters that with the rise of China as a global superpower, this partnership is gradually devolving into a Vaza-Zuzarian paradigm, with alarm being raised across the continent, and this is true, of infrastructural and loan-based new colonialism. How would you address this perception of China's engagement with Africa in the context of the International Decade of People of African Descent, remembering that the diaspora Africans, us, are the 6th region of Africa? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, sir, you have the floor. Brief question, okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I was astounded and quite shocked and sad also to hear about a lot of the Afrophobia that exists in many different countries. I just wanted to underscore that we're at a moment right now in global politics where there's an opportunity for third world solidarity in ways that there hasn't been for a very, very long time. You know, when we're talking about strides in loss and damages in COP28, when we're talking about the rise of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, when we're talking about the reintroduction of language around the right to development, you know, we have the opportunity right now to align the global South and reconstruct a new international economic order. But, you know, Muhammad Ali was very famous when in his opposition against the Vietnam War. And when he was asked why he was opposed to the Vietnam War and why much of black opinion was opposed to the Vietnam War, he said, "No Vietnamese ever called me the N-word." And this is really important. When we're talking about fighting Afrophobia in the global South, we're not just talking about discrimination, we're not just talking about inclusion, but this is an obstacle to building third world solidarity. So I'm hoping that all heads of states here take it as the utmost of importance to ensure the end of Afrophobia in your countries so that we can unite and we can fight for the right to development. We can fight for reparations and reparatory justice. This is extremely, extremely important. On one last point, since the post-colonial era, our solidarity among each other has broken down, and this is partially because of the hierarchies we have among each other. We saw in the breakdown of diplomatic relations between Kuwait and Philippines, how the treatment of domestic workers of Filipino descent in the Middle East has caused the people of the Philippines to be angry. We need to abolish these kinds of hierarchies among each other. And finally, when it comes to the political things that we can do, and I now just want to talk concretely, end Afrophobia in our countries, end Afrophobia in our countries, and then also stand, stand for this kind of global South unity. There are concrete ways that we can do that. Countries can stand with South Africa right now and Namibia in the ICJ,
yeah,
and they can fight for reparations.
Thank you. But please identify yourself, right? Thank you. Okay. We have more for, okay, two more. Yeah, okay. Madam, you have the floor.
Okay, I am Anthony No from Chulalongkorn University. I just want to respond to the comment made by the ambassador there. You know, when it comes to issues of Nigerians being involved in scam-related crimes, particularly in Southeast Asia, I just want him to know there's a recent study conducted by IOM in Thailand, and they discovered how complex racism could actually function. Because what happened particularly was that recently there's a new trend by some Chinese in collaboration with folks from Thailand, particularly from Southeast Asia, a kind of mafia network where they recruit young Africans through Facebook, lure them with, job opportunities, and there's a kind of route they've actually created where they bring them through Nairobi to Bangkok, and then they end up in the jungles of Laos, between Laos and Thailand. There's a jungle they've created there, so these Africans work for them. And the whole thing is to keep the real perpetrator behind, while Africans are actually shown in the picture. So these guys are actually held captives. They're not allowed to go anywhere, and it's a real issue. And it would be interesting if the United Nations can actually pay close attention to it, because it's a real issue, and this continue to highlight crimes committed by Africans, whereas the people involved are actually innocent. They were deceived into it, and they're forced to do the job, and this is tainting the image of Africa, while everyone is saying Africans commit crime in Southeast Asia, including Nigeria, they're forced into it. So this is really something I want to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir, for your comment and also for your concern on this situation. Yeah, personally, but not to take much time, but I would say that this is really a serious, because it's a cyber crime, that has been organized by transnational criminal groups. So this it requires concerted efforts, regional efforts to combat and to unroot it, those grounds, including in Myanmar, and the border areas. So this is really an issue that we need to take into serious consideration. Thank you. Okay, Madame, I think she left? Oh, sorry. Okay, if that's the case, I think I will give the floor to the panelists, okay, to respond to the questions. Madame,
all right.
You have the floor.
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, I will go first. First, these two questions addressed to me are huge, really huge questions, actually. And I suppose I can answer through my own personal lens and experiences. This, of course, does not represent the larger answer and larger ways in which we could work together to better communication and development between the two regions. My dear senior advisor, mentor, and why I say that, because you have so much experience in this field, in this study of different peoples and relations, especially in Australia. I can say that the definition of invasion, it's easy to see it as a human behavior, because that same definition can be said in China, specifically in regions like Guangzhou, where the Chinese people feel that the Africans are invading China. So it is in China, it is also in Africa. People are feeling this because, in my opinion, I could be wrong, is that it is an introduction of something that's new to the whole societal dynamic, the whole ecosystem, what they're accustomed to. Something new has entered that ecosystem, and they're trying to figure out how to balance, how to compete. How do I tackle that in my department? As someone that also was a part of being defined as someone that's invading China, as opposed to being confused, I decided to be solution-oriented. So my department focuses on giving those skills to these youth to be able to compete in initiatives that are in their own said countries or also in their said provinces. For example, one of the people that I highlighted in my PPT, this young Zambian youth, he was given the opportunity to come here to China to study, to get the skills, but also equally given this opportunity to partner with Chinese enterprises to bring back to his own society, to contribute, to be a part of that solution. So the concept of invasion becomes positive. I have invaded, quote unquote, a society to learn the skills and take that skills to bring back to my community. So it is this, so sorry. So it is a difficult question to answer, but from the practical examples that I've seen from youth, what they do with those bigger, challenging, overarching questions is using their set experiences to be part of helping their community in a smaller aspect or in a larger aspect. My department partners with them to give those access to those learning opportunities to change the narrative and turn a negative into a positive. To my brother that mentioned there are negative aspects and positive aspects to infrastructure. I need to be very brief. But I would have to say that this question, I had an interesting conversation with a former Chinese official. I had the same question to him. And his answer was that for China, the Belt and Road Initiative are business opportunities. So once they enter once they engage with different stakeholders, we're talking business. We're negotiating. We're two partners, two stakeholders. So it is between you and I to set the terms of our negotiation. So it's not one party. It's two parties, it's multi-stakeholders. So we cannot say that one person is solely responsible for something. And at the end of that discussion, he then reiterated that we are all in the ship of development, every one of us. And we have to come together as a society to work towards the common goal of development. But at the end of the day, it is business. So together, you set your terms, I set my terms, and we follow through. So this is, to answer your question, this is the answer that I received. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ducreay. Okay, now I would like to give the floor, invite Madame Choi. You answer the question and further comments.
Just in the interest of time, let me just say two things in response to the conversations that we're having and the questions that I've received. I think maybe something to think about. I mean, in the context of whenever I go look at research North Korean cultural diplomacy in Africa, right? So, but as a South Korean, it's always a question of what becomes visible for me is the competition, right, between North and South Korea for influence in Africa and Southeast Asia. So whenever there are projects that with prominent that builds on third world solidarity that is led by DPRK, then we also see the language of South Korea's South-South cooperation. But one thing to remember in that context is that North Korea is part of the non-aligned movement. South Korea did not join the non-aligned movement. South Korea is part of the OECD, right? OECD countries, and its development project, right? It's not a developing country, right? So South Korea, in many ways, is divided when it comes to issues about where does Korea sit in relation to third world solidarity and the global South, right? So it's a site of Cold War politics. So that's the most important thing. So going back to your question, right, about, so what is the future, right? And I think, and I'm thinking about it in relation to the first comment also raised by, sorry, I forget. We've never met, but I mean, yes. Look East policy, right? What is up with that? And it is actually a human rights violation to say, oh, you can travel to Asia, China, Southeast Asia, Korea, and there's a future there. When the issue of Afrophobia, as you pointed out, the language that you introduced, is not being tackled as an important policy issue, right? So I think on that point, actually, ASEAN can play a very important role, right? In the sense that ASEAN is a regional mechanism that has history and connections with Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement. That is precisely where these conversations and where actually a country like South Korea should be looking for leadership, right? And from the ASEAN countries. In terms of how do we tackle these issues? How do we take the right to development of people of African descent seriously? Wherein the leaders where precisely these kind of issues are worked out. So I would love to see leadership from your office, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Choi. Thank you for your comment. I think, Madam, you are back, so still want to raise a question? Brief, 1 minute, okay?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Walia Mwali. I'm representing INGWE, an organization from Belgium, and I'm happy to join the Pacific and Asia delegates today. I just wanted to reflect on the presentations done by most of the people here. How could we leverage these successful practices in the different countries represented here for the broader achievement of mitigating discrimination and racism in the countries where we live as diaspora members. My organization, we're advocating for a database for skills and talents of people of African descent and Africans so that we when there's need, we can deploy, send directly to people that are involved. I mean, we all have a lot of experiences, a lot of skills. So instead of continuing just talking about it, we can share, have that we can refer to it. I think this is what I would like to advocate for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam, for your comment. And Joy, so you would like to respond? Okay, very brief. Okay.
I would just like to respond to what you said. This is also what we are advocating in my department as well, how to connect all youth to people like you, to organizations like you, to have those opportunities either through job, either through knowledge, to create that database. Where are you? Where are the African students? Where are the African people of descent? But where are you so that we can learn? So I hope that through this today, these past 2 days, everyone that's in attendance, let's make our own group. Let's create our own database and be that initial access point for organizations like mine to have that on-the-ground connectivity to people who need it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ducreay. I think we need to give the floor to Professor Ibhawoh. Sir, you have the floor for your further comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll be very brief as a roundup. So when we have conversations like this, very often we end with one question. What do we do? What are the action items? How do we move from being just having a conversation on this question to making a difference? So I think one has been identified, and this one that we've been talking about for a long time. Data, data, data. We need disaggregated data. So I like the last intervention about creating a database, not waiting for states. Civil society organizations can take the lead, working with international organizations to provide this database. I'll just add another action item, something we can do from the perspective of the Right to Development agenda. So as I speak, the Right to Development, which has been a declaration since the 1980s, almost 3 decades now or more, is now working its way through the UN system to become a covenant, the transition from soft law to hard law. There's been extensive debate in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, and it is now moving to New York. There are lots of reasons why we need to make the Right to Development a legally binding instrument, because it will be an effective way of addressing so many of the issues we've identified in this session. But as you can imagine, there's been also opposition from some state actors, from some civil society organizations, frankly, that do not want the Right to Development to become a legally binding instrument. So my charge this afternoon is advocacy. I urge civil society actors here present. I urge states here present to lend their voice through the usual sources, pressure their representative, both in Geneva and in New York, to support the development towards making the Right to Development a legally binding instrument. You can find a draft of the legally binding Right to Development agenda on the UN website. And I think this is one action item that we can all rally around to ensure that so many of the issues we've addressed here today can now really be entrenched in international human rights law. Because we know from experience that once we have the law, the legal instrument, it doesn't answer all the questions, it doesn't solve all the problems, but at least it gives us the tool to begin to hold states accountable for their obligations under these international human rights instruments. So that would be my action item for this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ibhawoh. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we have heard all the comments, presentations by the panelists, as well as the Q&A session is concluded. Just allow me one sentence to say I'm so honored to moderate this session, and I learned a lot from you, from the panelists and participants. And just a quick response to the solidarity issue. I know that this is there's a long way to go for Asia, Pacific, African, Caribbeans, we need to join together. And also, for your information, you may know that in a few days, there will be the Global South Summit in Uganda. And I think the leaders from regions, they would make a strong, they will send out a strong message that solidarity and cooperation is important and we need to do more. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Allow me to thank you warmly, Professor Huang, for your excellent moderation of the panel 3 entitled Development. I also like to thank our distinguished panelists for their rich and insightful presentations. And I would also like to thank the delegates and the meeting participants for their participation. The Secretariat would like to remind participants to send their written statement by email at the address that you could see on the screen. Don't leave the room. We take a 5-minute break and we will resume for the closing. Thank you.